Dr. Econ here with another explanation of how our economy works. Today, we talk about the Federal Reserve and interest rates, and how the Treasury and the Federal Reserve tend to work together. We have a situation coming up where the Federal Reserve has been charging more and more interest rates as they've been trying to rein in inflation. Part of the challenge with doing that is that the Treasury pays whatever interest rate that they can get on the Treasury bonds. Well, the challenge, if you raise interest rates on the Treasury bonds, just like you raise interest rates on mortgages, the person paying back the money has to pay a much higher interest rate. And so it is with the Treasury as well. Couple that with the fact that as our currency, the US dollar, has grown in strength against other currencies around the world because of our higher interest rates, now you have a situation where other economies are struggling to meet their budgets. They're struggling to continue to work in their environment because of imports getting more expensive that come for the United States and various other challenges that come when their currency gets devalued on the world stage. So what's happening is simply you've got a Treasury that's getting worried about being able to sell bonds to meet its debts. So we've got a perfect storm developing here where we've got rising interest rates both in the personal markets and also for our US Treasury. Now here's where the story gets interesting. So let's look at a few numbers. This is a chart that shows, in the blue on the left-hand side, it shows how much more the GDP was than the amount of debt. The line going below zero shows that the amount of debt was lower than the total GDP of the time. So if we say GDP stays level this whole time, what's the comparison of our federal debt versus the amount of gross domestic product that we create from our economy? So as we go out, you see that they crossed each other in about 1985 or so, right in there. But all that red to the right that you see, all that red means that our debt has been higher than what the economy has produced since 1985. We're talking nearly 40 years of GDP less than the amount of debt that our federal government has incurred. So you can see that it started easing a little bit between 2008 and 2010, but then it rose again. And then when COVID hit, of course, they went on a money printing spree, and you can see that it just goes radically straight up in the 2019-2020 range. So what's happening here is now the Treasury is very sensitive to interest rates. When you raise interest on all commodities in the United States, in other words, you raise interest at the Federal Reserve level, it flows into the bonds that the Treasury sells. It also flows into mortgages and all the way through the economy. So now you raise interest rates on what now is nearly a little over $70 trillion in debt. You're paying out quite a bit of interest. So here we have a statement by Robert Burgess. He says, "The word crisis is not hyperbole. Liquidity is quickly evaporating. Volatility is soaring. Once unthinkable, even demand at the government debt auctions is becoming a concern. Conditions are so worrisome that Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen took the unusual step Wednesday of expressing concern about a potential breakdown in trading, saying after a speech in Washington that her department is worried about a loss of adequate liquidity." Now, let's define a few terms. What does it mean by adequate liquidity? What it means is, take your personal budget, and all of a sudden your expenses are higher than your income. You have a liquidity crisis in your budget. You don't have enough money to pay your bills. That's a liquidity crisis. And that is exactly what Janet Yellen is talking about. He says, in the $23.7 trillion market for government securities, make no mistake, if the Treasury market seizes up, the global economy and financial system will have much bigger problems than elevated inflation. Okay. In other words, the federal government has to keep paying its bills. If the federal government doesn't keep paying its bills, our Treasury notes become worthless. Once our Treasury notes become worthless, once the good faith and credit of the United States is brought into question, those Treasury bonds get dumped on the market. Their value goes to zero. The interest rate goes through the ceiling because, remember, as the value of the bond decreases, the amount of interest paid on them increases. So let's go on to the next thing. She says, all this is coming as Bloomberg News reports that the biggest, most powerful buyers of treasuries, the Japanese pensions, the life insurers to foreign governments, U.S. commercial banks, are all pulling back at the same time. We need to find a new marginal buyer of treasuries as central banks and banks overall are exiting stage left. Now, part of the challenge here is that the Federal Reserve, in their quantitative easing, the first thing they buy, it was treasuries. And so in them being the primary buyer of treasuries, now they're going into some tightening periods. And because they're tightening, that means they're not buying as many treasuries or not buying any at all. They are pulling back, and so they're not a primary purchaser of the treasuries. So the treasury notes go unbought, and as they go unbought, they don't have adequate buyers. What happens? Simple supply and demand. We can do the equation again. Less demand, too much supply, price goes down. In this case, interest rates continue to climb on the U.S. Treasury bonds. So let's look at it. This is a graph of the federal funds rate. In other words, the interest rate that the Federal Reserve charges their member banks. You can see that over time up here, as I've circled, Paul Volcker, in order to rein in a decades-long series of interest rates and inflation that had been rampant since the early 70s, raised interest rates well into the 18% range. Back then, that was Paul Volcker and the way he reined in inflation. He was successful, and later on, as time went on, interest went down, so the federal funds rate continued to go down with the inflation rate. So inflation went down. And so as inflation went down, the federal funds rate continued to go down. After a while, Alan Greenspan came in the early 1980s, and Alan Greenspan held the position for many, many years. And he basically had the idea that the Federal Reserve would work hard to control interest rates, that their target for unemployment would be 5% and the target for inflation would be 2%. And they were successful, and they used the lever of the Federal Reserve to continue monitoring and working with the economy to keep inflation at a low rate. You can see in the 1990 era there, 1991 or so, right in there was a recession, and they lowered the funds rate so that they could get more borrowing happening and get the economy back going. And so it was a relatively short recession. And then, of course, you have, early 2000s, you have 2002, where we had a small recession. You see then, as they continued to lighten the amount of interest paid on loans, the federal funds rate after the year 2000 went down to a very low rate, 1.5% to 2%. During that period of time, suddenly you had mortgages that were incredibly cheap. You have huge inflationary cycles that the Federal Reserve then, running up to the 2008 crisis, kept raising interest rates until they finally broke the back of the mortgage market. Well, the mortgage market seized up, loaning stopped on houses, and then the Federal Reserve responds with another knee-jerk reaction to lower interest rates to nearly zero, and it stays that way from 2009, 2010, all the way up to 2015. And then now, they haven't really got very far to go. Remember the discussion. We've got a situation where the federal debt now is in excess of where it's ever been and continuing to rise farther. If the Federal Reserve raises interest rates too much, they're going to actually put an imbalance in the U.S. Treasury to the point that they cannot borrow enough. So you've got a crisis brewing here where Janet Yellen is already worried about being able to sell her bonds to continue paying all this debt and pay all the budget. And at the same time, Jerome Powell wants to continue raising rates to rein in inflation. He cannot get as aggressive as Paul Volcker because he doesn't have the freedom to do so. Should he do so, he would bankrupt the United States and cause worse problems than inflation. And that's where it all comes around with Robert Burgess's statement here that we'd have a whole lot bigger problem if U.S. Treasuries couldn't be sold, or the faith and confidence in the United States debt or ability to pay our bills was jaded in the world market, and suddenly they started dumping bonds onto the market, thus even lowering the price even more and crushing the ability of the U.S. Treasury to continue paying out that level of interest. So here we have a situation. We're going to watch what the Federal Reserve does and see how aggressive they become. But I truly think that there's going to be a limit as to what the Federal Reserve can do. That limit is going to be where it gets on the edge of bankrupting the United States government. If that happens, we've got real problems. So I don't think the Federal Reserve is going to go there. We'll see how they deal with the fact that they've got that problem with interest rates, and they still have to provide enough liquidity to buy the U.S. Treasury notes so that they can pay their bill. I don't know how they're going to deal with it. We will have to see. Well, if you liked what you heard here, and if it was informative to you, hit that like button. Please subscribe so we can grow the channel and reach out to more people. And, I hope you stay safe. Get out of debt. This is another cautionary tale of the United States getting into too much debt, much less us as individuals being in too much debt. So be safe, and until next time, thanks. See you later.